Frontline Conversations, leading the debate since 1984.
When we think about the fall of the Mughal Empire, we always think of it as a very simplistic process. Essentially, the British show up, they defeat us at the Battle of Plassey, and voila, the British Raj has begun. But in Ira Mukhoty's spectacular new book on the history of Awadh, we at last have a much grander and more complex narrative of how exactly the British became ascendant in India, but much more importantly, how remarkable regional courts across the subcontinent push back against British imperialism and participate in a flourishing era of regional and international exchange. Ira, thank you so much for joining us. It's such an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Anirudh. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me on here.
It's a pleasure. So I'd like to begin by trying to understand first, how did you decide on Awadh? Of all the things that are happening in the 18th century, why was it particularly the Awadh region that you decided to make the focus of this book?
Yes. So initially, Anirudh, I was thinking that I would focus more closely on simply the French influence. What were the French doing from the late 17th century onwards, how they were evolving in the 18th century. But then I realized that it was much more interesting to look at French involvement through the provinces that were using French influence, and to see the ways in which they were able to navigate these, very treacherous currents with the British and the French and then the other regional rulers. And what I found was that actually after the Battle of Plassey, as you were pointing out, that is where we think that we begin our story. Soon after that, there's actually the Battle of Buxar, which is much more important, in which Bengal and Bihar are taken over. The revenue generating resources are taken over by the British. And the next province to come into the line of fire is actually Awadh, because it is the so-called buffer region between Bengal and Mughal Delhi. But it is also an extremely prosperous region, and it is one that is being ruled by very ambitious and very capable men, the Nawabs of Awadh. So I wanted to show, after the Bengal situation has occurred, Plassey and Buxar have occurred, what happens in Awadh, where the French are also starting to get involved, and the British are casting a leery eye on Awadh and its great resources. So I thought that would be a good way for us to navigate the 18th century, because it is important right through the second half of the 18th century. It shows a lot of the changes that are occurring in India at that time, from, say, a medieval past to the early modern, a situation that we have. And it shows how a new province is able to stand up to the British using means that we don't think of as traditional ones. And I thought that was the reason that Awadh would be a good place to start.
So I'd really like to dive into all of these interesting points that you brought up. But first, can you mentioned that Awadh is ruled by some of the most capable and ambitious rulers in India at the time. So who exactly were the ruling family of Awadh? Where did they come from? How did they come to be established in that particular region?
So they come from neighboring Persia, which in the late 17th century and early 18th century is crumbling. The Persian Empire. And so we have a lot of very talented officers, elite men coming over from Persia into India, looking for work at the Mughal court, which is still sort of hanging on to the last of its luster. And at this time, we have a nobleman called Saadat Khan. And he comes from Nishapur in Persia, and he gets employment at the Mughal court. And he is first given the Suba of Agra, which is a very prosperous, obviously, Agra has been the Mughal capital. So he's given the Suba of Agra to manage. But one day he is unable to quell a Jat rebellion, which has been, taking place around Delhi at that time. And as a punishment, he is sent to Awadh. And he is told, you will have the Suba of Awadh instead of Agra is taken away from you. But what Saadat Khan does in Awadh is establish it as a hereditary sort of province, which it was not meant to be. He was meant to be transferred every 3 or 4 years. After him comes his son-in-law Safdarjung, and then Safdarjung's son Shujauddaulah, who is the focus of a great part of the early bit of my book, because he is a man who really transforms the destiny of Awadh. He is present at the Battle of Buxar, and we see a very different man at the time of the Battle of Buxar. And when he is defeated, he uses all the energy which he has had in the early part of his life, which he uses in a very different manner, pursuing his own personal pleasures and being generally a military man, but also a man about town. But then he transforms those energies completely into making Awadh this great political and cultural center.
So speaking of Shuja, you had quite a few interesting anecdotes about the scandals of his early life, including, I believe, him climbing into a young lady's apartment in Banaras, and how and I actually found the way that you used it narratively very interesting, because you actually showed how his parents reacted to the scandal and how they used it as a sort of teaching incident. So could you tell us a little bit about this affair, and could you tell us could you use it to chat a little bit about the philosophy of kingship, as it were? How did the rulers of Awadh, even though they came from Persia, how did they see themselves as responsible to their subjects? What was their philosophy of rulership?
Yes, that's an interesting point, Anirudh. And so when I was reading some of these anecdotes, I thought, it was very interesting actually, because so Shuja-ud-Dawla is caught a number of times trying to sneak into the homes of young ladies. This is, of course, women he's not married to in any way engaged to. But unlike, say, the situation we see, unfortunately, in day-to-day in India today, where rich and wealthy parents will try and hide the transgressions of their sons and their children and try to, bribe their way out of trouble so that their children, can stay completely out of trouble. What Nawab Begum, his mother, and Safdarjung do is that they take this extremely seriously. And they punish him. They tell the kotwal to treat him like any ordinary criminal. So he's taken to prison. He's kept there and not allowed to change his clothes. So he's in filthy clothes. He's treated like any prisoner. And every week he's presented to his father, and his father, to the darbar of his father. And his father every week sort of ignores him and sends him back. And this goes on for months until at last Nawab Begum, intercedes on his behalf and allows him to return to court. But this just shows us, how very seriously Nawab Begum and Safdarjung were taking their roles as the rulers of this area. And they wanted to show to their son that this kind of egregious behavior against women, against, another community would not be tolerated at all. And in fact, these incidents seem to have a very strong effect on Shuja-ud-Dawla, because soon after the debacle of Buxar, when he returns to Awadh and gives up helping Shah Alam altogether and the Mughal cause, there's one of the English company men who writes with some alarm about the change that he is seeing himself in Shuja-ud-Dawla. And he says this is a man who would begin his day before dawn, jump onto a horse, ride into the forest, shoot a lion, shoot a few deer, come back, jump into the icy baths, and spend the afternoon in the harem. Now suddenly he's taking an interest in ruling his country. He's taking an interest in promoting industry, in promoting or building activities, in culture. It's very worrying, So clearly, once Shuja-ud-Dawla comes to his senses in a way, once he grows up to the fact that he now has to rule this country of Awadh, he clearly has a very strong sense of responsibility to the people, because he's making huge efforts to encourage trade, to encourage manufacture. He sets up a factory to manufacture guns and muskets and all sorts, and to improve the technology. So he's worried about the defense of his country. He is improving trade in a great way. And so we realize that he is not just a man who's going to sit back and relax and enjoy the wealth that he has at his disposal. He is somebody who wants to make it an even greater center of culture and a politically important area. So it tells us, a great deal about how he matured as a person, and how these rulers viewed their role in society as a protector and someone who was there to encourage all aspects of life.
I was particularly interested by the fact that Shuja-ud-Dawla was attempting to modernize his military by setting up gun foundries, as you just mentioned. I think there's very often a tendency to think about Indian armies of the 18th century as being uniformly on the back foot against European powers. But I think that Shuja-ud-Dawla, it seems that at one point, his army could easily have gone toe-to-toe with European forces, because the British were supremely concerned about what he was up to with the French. And of course, that
Absolutely.
brings me to my next question, because
Absolutely. Yeah.
what I find very interesting, Ira, is that just as the Mughal court is able to absorb officials from Persia, which is in chaos right next to them, it seems that the court of Awadh is also able to attract talented people from even further away, all the way to Europe, in fact. And you started our discussion by talking about how you're interested in kind of tracing out the activities of the French in the 18th century. So could you tell us, how was it that the French came to be involved in India in general and with Awadh in particular?
Yeah, so it's one of the very interesting and little known, I think, and forgotten aspects of the 18th century is the role of the French. And as Maya Jasanov, has written so eloquently in Edge of Empire, we cannot look at the way India developed and the British role in India without looking at France in parallel, because what was happening in the 18th century is that by then the Portuguese and the Dutch and the other, colonizing forces are out of the picture, and it is really Britain versus France. And they are involved throughout the 18th century in this huge global struggle for supremacy. France had started the 18th century as the much bigger neighbor of Britain with a much bigger land army. Britain was this tiny island with a small population. So they always had this anxiety vis-a-vis France, but they started, increasing their colonial the colonial empire by the mid 18th century. And in 1763, it's the end of the 7-Year War, which is an important war over their holdings in North America and the Caribbean and throughout the world. And they kind of divide up their global empire between Britain and France, and a peace is brought about. But what the French do, because they are the ones who have been on the losing side of the 7-Year War, so they decide instead that they would start a guerre de revanche, which is a war of revenge against the British, which is going to be done in a much more covert manner. So they themselves start modernizing their army, increasing their naval capabilities, which till then had not been on par with the British. And they are sent to different corners of the world with orders to block British power wherever they can. So it's not in a sense, a war to conquer new territories like in India, but it is a war specifically to block British interests. So this is how in India we suddenly find that once Pondicherry and Chandanagar have been more or less destroyed by the British, following the peace of 1763, all these officers and adventurers and military men find themselves in all the powerful courts of India with these specific aims to block the British wherever they can and to help those Indian rulers who are receptive to their ideas, who are willing to take on new ideas for technology improvement, military improvement. And that's what Shuja-ud-Dawla does, because at the Battle of Buxar is such a terrible debacle for him. His huge infantry has been shown to be made of straw almost, because they have really very little firing power. His cavalrymen are completely chaotic. So he decides to completely reform his army with the help of the French. So we have a particular character whom I talk about, Jean-Baptiste Gentil. But there are many others. He has hundreds of French people employed at his court specifically to make it technologically superior to what it was before and the equal of the British. And I think by about the 1765, around there, he has 30,000 excellently trained troops along the lines of the European fighting forces. So we see that, unlike what we are told, a lot of Indian rulers are willing to take on their technology, and not only willing, they are able to. So that shows us that they have reached a certain level of competence where they are able to absorb these ideas and put them into action. It's not just, it doesn't stay on paper. Both Shuja-ud-Dawla and we know, of course, Tipu Sultan, who's doing the same thing in Mysore. These rulers are extremely capable. They put in the money and they change the technology of their armies completely.
To me, what is most remarkable about this era is you talk early in your book about how when the French first began to reach Delhi with news of the defeat at Buxar, that there's this incredulity in the court of Delhi. They don't seem to fully understand that, first of all, that France and England are separate countries, and they're unable to understand that Bengal, such a rich and wealthy and sprawling province, has fallen entirely under the control of the British. And yet, in a matter of just a few decades, you have courts across the entirety of South Asia that have not only managed to understand this difference between the French and the English, but actually exploit it to their own gain,
Yeah.
and to modernize their armies.
Yes.
I do want to talk a little more about Tipu Sultan, especially because being somebody from the Deccan, I always love hearing the exploits of my countrymen. But I'd like to take a bit of a step back and chat a little bit about the narrative structure of the book as well, um, which I found very interesting. How after setting up in the first few chapters these dramatic political events that shape Shuja's character, you then take a little time to explore the court that he's setting up in Awadh, and its various characters, the interactions between the begums and their retinues, and the interesting ways in which food culture actually also interlinked with political culture. So I'd like to first ask you, why did you think that this narrative structure was what you wanted to go with? How did you decide on this particular way of telling the story? And secondly, can you tell us a little bit about the courts of Awadh? What kind of people might one find at court? What kind of behaviors did they use to navigate? And especially, can you tell us a little bit about the way that they handled diplomacy with the burgeoning part of the East India Company always at the doorstep?
Yeah. So I think in terms of the structure of the book, because I'm writing for a lay audience, I find that the stories of individual people, individual characters whom I can flesh out and bring to life as much as possible, is something that appeals to a lay reader who is perhaps not a student of history per se, who is not a historian certainly or a scholar. I feel that the way to lure a person, if you like, into a book which is relatively dense, such as mine is. It does have a lot of information, so a way to get interested is in the lives of people, individual characters. Apart from them, I find them supremely fascinating. All these characters who are hovering around the courts, especially of Awadh at this time. I often, compare this our history with that of Game of Thrones, and I find that ours is just as interesting, just as bloody, just as full of treason and all sort of skullduggery. So I feel that writing about these things captures people's imagination. You can bring these places to life by talking about the characters. So I spend quite a lot of time, I think, in the first half, talking about the various characters, and I also want to bring to people's notice the important idea that people were not at this point defined by their religion. We often think, okay, so all the Europeans are Christians, therefore they will have a commonality, perhaps vis-a-vis the Indian rulers, but this is not at all the case. The French and the British are pitted against each other despite being Christians, because one is Catholic and one is Protestant. And that is extremely important to their sense of identity. So we have at these courts a very cosmopolitan cast of characters, some of whom we are surprised to find there, say, fighting for the British, being spies for the British, somebody like Antoine Follier, who is a Frenchman. Technically, he's a French speaker, but he is also Protestant, which makes it easier for him to align his interest with that of the rising EIC company. So these kind of particular examples, I think, help to bring out the nuance of a very textured court in which all sorts of people, cosmopolitan people, you have Afghan players, you have Persians, you have Turkeys, and you have all these various Europeans with conflicting interests. So it's easier to bring that out than with a structure such as that which I have used. And then we have the question, of course, as you were saying, of how do all these people now interact with each other? How is diplomacy carried out? And one way in which I explored that was to look at the way, the spy system is something that we don't think about very much today, except for the James Bond movies. But the spy system, espionage, is extremely important in the late 18th century. It's the way in which every Indian ruler keeps a tab on all their neighbors with power. So, they will send a harkara, which is literally harkar, a man who will do all jobs. They send these messengers as spies or to relay information at every single court of any importance. And then they will send it to their neighbors. They will send it to, within women's quarters. And the British become incredibly skilled at doing this. Initially, they don't know how to get information about these courts. They are on the back foot. And slowly they learn how to do this by using access to the zenana, for example. So what the Begums, for example, were doing, which is an interesting way in which they carried out their diplomacy, was they used these elite eunuchs in the 18th century who were called Khwaja Saras, because the eunuchs were their the way in which they accessed the outer world. These were women in zenana, in Parda, so they were not able to cross those boundaries themselves. So they had these elite eunuchs who were very well-educated, scholarly men who were able to carry out the messengers and the orders of these women. So these were the men who were sent, for example, to Calcutta to speak to the councilmen. And I suppose it's interesting, it's an interesting way in which times were changing, because the British men were very uncomfortable dealing with these Khwaja Saras. They didn't quite know how to classify them. They themselves tended to talk of eunuchs as these effeminate, androgynous characters, sort of lisping about the scene. But the Indian writers, when they write about them, write of these very virile men, men with power, men with authority. So it's very interesting to see these differences, these cultural differences. So Khwaja Saras were one way in which diplomacy was carried out. Espionage was very important. Spies were very important. So, I realized while working on this book that one of the men I write about, Antoine Paulier, was in fact a spy who was working for various courts and who was selling information to whoever paid him the most at a certain time. There was no sense of loyalty per se to any one ruler or to even to the EIC. So diplomacy was an extremely intricate and involved matter, which required a knowledge of all sorts of courts and information, and was carried on at really high levels. And I was very, very impressed to see the way in which the Begums, for example, were able to carry on negotiations with the Mughal court far away in Delhi and with the British, sitting in council in Calcutta at the same time.
I think that's a great note to segue to another of those very interesting 18th century characters who's indulging in diplomacy, and that, of course, is at last Tipu Sultan. So what I think you had this wonderful line about how Tipu, how he begins by trying to cultivate the court of Louis XVI. And then even after the French Revolution, he does, which is very anti-royal and very anti-establishment, he does this like remarkable sort of like diplomatic pirouette and convinces themselves that he's like a citizen sultan who's trying to overthrow British imperialism. So you can tell us a little bit about Tipu Sultan and the French. How did he develop his interest in this kingdom? How was it that he conceived of an embassy? And how were these embassies to France received?
So that's an excellent question. And I have to say, I have a huge fondness for Tipu Sultan. And initially, when I was thinking of the book, and I was thinking about the French and the British and India, I had thought of setting up these two courts to talk about Awadh and to talk about Tipu Sultan equally, and to see how two very different courts deal with the same issue and what the outcome would be in dealing with the same problem, i.e. the British East India Company. What would be the outcome? One militarily and one if you use it more culturally. But in the end, it didn't work out that way. But I do have a lot of sympathy for Tipu Sultan. The British considered Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan their oldest and longest serving allies and friends. I think what's interesting is that Hyder Ali first came across the French when he observed Dupleix, the very successful French Governor General in the south. And Dupleix was very successful against the Nawab of the Carnatic. He was the first, not Robert Clive, to use French-trained troops to defeat a Mughal army. So when Hyder Ali saw that, he realized that these were the men to court and these were the men to have on his side, because he had already gauged how very aggressive and ambitious the British were. So he started, keeping an alliance with the French, which his son then carried on. And the French were always also extremely sympathetic towards Tipu Sultan and thought of him in terms of their strongest ally, more than any other ruler in India. And this was because I think Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali, of course, before him, were the only rulers to send embassies to France, to have a very realistic idea, a very pragmatic idea of what was happening in the world, this global war which we are talking about, the Franco-British global war. Only Mysore was truly aware of what was happening because of the embassies they sent, because the information that they were able to get back very regularly from France. And so this resulted in first, Tipu Sultan having close links with pre-revolutionary France. At that time, he was trying to get soldiers across, he was trying to get military equipment across. And then finally, the French Revolution was about to happen, but he had already sent his embassy to France by then. This was 1788. They arrived in 1788. And they arrived in great style. There were three main men from his court, and of course their entourage. And they arrived with their chefs, with their cooks, with their equipment, with their clothes, everything. And the people of Paris, it is said, they were like the stars of their time. The Beyoncés of their time. And people were sort of wherever they stepped out of their house to go down the Champs-Élysées, to go down the big boulevards. Apparently, there was a crowd of people, including ladies and women, who wanted to see the clothes they were wearing, because they were considered the very heights of sophistication, the very heights of luxurious goods. And apparently there were gangs of urchins and eager people around the chefs when they were cooking their food. They wanted to know what went into their food. So they were greeted with a lot of, I think, warmth and curiosity, but also because this is 1788 and the French Revolution is about to happen, also with a little bit of suspicion, because this is exactly the reason for which Marie Antoinette would fall, for which Louis XVI would fall, a sense of heightened exoticism and luxury, which is being associated with only the upper caste, where the common people are suffering, they hardly have any food to eat. So it is a very tricky time for Tipu Sultan to have sent his embassy there. Nonetheless, they return in good health with some amount of the goods that he had asked them to bring back. And after the revolution, such are the links of friendship that tie Tipu Sultan to France, is that even the revolutionary government decides to keep up their links with Tipu Sultan, because they realize that he's really the one man who understands the role of the French. The only small problem they have is that they have to make him understand that they can no longer call him the Sultan of Mysore. He has to be called a citoyen, which is an ordinary citizen. But Tipu Sultan, being the pragmatic man that he is, agrees to calling himself Citoyen Tipu and carries on, corresponding and trying very hard to get the French to send him the support he needs.
Absolutely remarkable. I won't comment about what happens to Tipu later on. I'm sure most of our audience already knows. But I really enjoyed the gravitas, and I think the humanity that you brought to Tipu, given that he's very often thought about in these highly polarized terms. He's at the end of the day a very interesting Indian ruler. But
he's not only interesting, Anirudh, but we were talking about what the rulers were doing for their people, and Hyder Ali before him, and Tipu Sultan certainly was really trying to, improve their countries. They were trying to improve agriculture. They were trying to improve the type of cattle that were being reared, in very pragmatic and detailed ways, in silk manufacture, in manufacturing all sorts of goods. Tipu Sultan is a pragmatic ruler who wants his country to do well, and we have really just associated him with one aspect of his life and to his battles. But that is really the British narrative that we have been left with. They are only interested in talking about him as a warrior, and a warrior they were able to defeat. That is, their aim, and they have succeeded, unfortunately. But he has this much wider side to him, in which he is really trying, with all the resources at his that he had at his disposal, to improve the lot of his country and to bring it into the modern age using technology and manufacture.
You had this is very clear understanding through the book. This ability that I really admire, Ira, to look through the nonsense that the British are claiming and really ask, okay, so why are they saying this? This is what they're saying, but why are they actually saying this? And you find this really interesting pattern through the course of the 18th century, where whenever the British have decided they want to attack and conquer and take over a territory, they start to spread these rumors about how Indian rulers are effeminate, too feminine, that the women are too masculine, whereas the men are too feminine, that they're corrupt, that they overindulge in all these luxuries and so on. And it seems to be very much an ongoing theme with British imperialism, right? It seems that decade over decade, as this material starts to amass about how Indian rulers are, debauched degenerates who can't rule their own countries. British imperialism increasingly emerges as the only quote unquote solution to what should be done with India's political ruling class. How did this contrast with the way that the French saw India? And would you be open to commenting more broadly about the way the British have shaped our memory of this period?
Yeah. That's a fascinating point, and it's one that I had in mind. I think throughout the writing of this book, once I realized that the British have been extremely successful at propaganda. I mean, I think there's no other empire in the world which has left the kind of legacy they have simply because their propaganda machine was so extraordinarily finely tuned. So just to come to the French, and to answer that bit of it, whenever I came across recordings of the way in which the French were writing about the Indians, there were two aspects of it. So one was that India is this they had a lot of admiration and awe for the Indian culture that they saw in the 18th century. And they had this idea that India is unchanging. It's eternal India. So this idea of eternal India is a very French point of view. It's one that continues to today. So today in France, people will often talk to you about eternal India. It's unchanging values, it's unchanging ways which have lasted for millennia, So even the adventurers, and yes, they will not see, they don't want to see that century India that exists. So in the 18th century, very much the notion that these military men, adventurers had, oh, wonderful, unchanging India. The second India that they tended to kind of acknowledge was one that needed to have its chains broken. So they saw the British force presence in India with a great deal of abhorrence, of dread, and they had this sense that the British had put chains on the Indian rulers. They were seeking to debase them. It was unbelievable how with just a few thousand soldiers, they were managing to conquer an increasing large amount of territory in this country that they thought was quite wonderful in its own way. And they felt the need to be part of this process in which the chains of the Indians would be broken. So rather than have an idea that the British clearly had a much more sure idea of coming and conquering and taking over India, the French, perhaps because the French EIC was always state ruled, it was not a band of merchants, which is what the British East India Company began its life as for 100 years. It was always state governed. So the king was always part of the decision making. His ministers were always part. Various philosophers who were part of the French court were involved in decision making. So they did not have the same point of view as the British did of having this territorial expansionist policy towards India. It was more an idea of blocking the British wherever they can, breaking the chains of the Indians. But having said that, interestingly, when the French Revolution happened, so theoretically, liberty, fraternity, and equality for all men, that kind of did not extend to the Indians. So in Pondicherry, the governor of Pondicherry didn't say, let me liberate all my Indian brothers to have the same rights as the French. He just thought, oh, well, they're very lucky that it's the French who are ruling them because we will bring all these Enlightenment ideas to the Indians under our rule in Pondicherry, but we won't completely kind of set them free, you see. So there's always this slight dichotomy. But where the British were concerned, I have now strongly come to the conclusion that if you see a particular Indian ruler whom even we now in our national consciousness think of as very inept, very useless, very effeminate, very debauched, such as Wajid Uddola, or very despotic, very demonic, very bloodlusty sort of ruler like Tipu Sultan, it means that they were actually extremely capable rulers, because the British really feared the capable Indian rulers and went all out to make sure that the legacy that that people were left with was that these rulers were really at the end of it inept, and it was much better to have British rule in the place of these rulers. But really, as I hope I have shown in The Lion and the Lead, it means that these rulers were actually incredibly capable men, ambitious, resourceful, creative in the way they thought. And that was the reason why the British would react in the way they did and spread the sort of calumny that they were extremely successful in doing. That we have to, grant them that legacy has been really long lasting. And in fact, I found when I was doing my final bits of research, that they actually brought in something called Operation Legacy in 1947, as they were leaving all these colonies, when they were finally being thrown out of these colonies. They actually set up this system where all the incriminating documents left in these countries were being destroyed or taken back to England, safely kept under lock and key, because so much information was negative to the British point of view, would make the British seem, would cast them in such a negative light. And they didn't want that. They want people to remember them with respect and affection. These are the words they use. And so they destroyed a lot of our documents, which would support the sort of nefarious ways in which the British continue to rule their ex-colonies.
I think that's a very profound note for us to bring our conversation to a close for now, Ira. I'm sure we'll obviously pick it up wherever we run into each other next. But
Yes.
thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for this magnificent exploration of India on the transition to early modernity, and for so clearly examining the biases that we hold towards the colonial rulers who have shaped so much of our understanding of our own past. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Frontline, for having Ira and I, and we'll see you next time.
Frontline Conversations. Leading the debate since 1984.